All right, everybody. Thanks, Tim. I'm glad to be here. And at one point during the year, I'm sure all of you guys have this experience. We all look for businesses, and at a certain point, the next year rolls up, and the planning emails start landing in your mailbox, and you're like, you got to think about the next year. And this year, it really took me aback, because for me, 2020 has this magical property. Maybe it's all the sci-fi novels that I've read growing up or the movies that I watched, but 2020 is really the event horizon for many things. 2020 is where we have flying cars. When we have flying cars, war performance is no longer a problem because we figured out flying cars. And really here, like at this event, we're here to celebrate the end of our journey of web performance because we've solved it all. And as I was preparing this talk, I was looking at this picture, and it dawned on me that flying cars are probably a terrible idea. I mean, what could go wrong? All right, you have 4 high-performance blenders attached in front of a projectile. Anyway, so I'm still holding out a ray of hope that tomorrow all the speakers will tell us all the secrets for how we solve web performance. But really, I end up oscillating between these two states. On the one hand, I am often appalled at the user experience on the web. But then, in the same breath, when I take a step back and look at some of the things that we've been able to achieve over the last decade, and to some extent I've worked on web performance for the last decade, more or less full-time, it is actually quite astounding of all the things that we've been able to deliver. Just an incomplete list, right? Mobile-friendly. Like 10 years ago, we didn't even think about, we had a desktop web, and all of a sudden we have a mobile-friendly web. And that's an amazing transformation. We have HTTPS effectively on by default everywhere. Over 90% of the navigations are now secure. That used to be less than 5 or 10%, 10 years ago. We have things like HTTP2 and HTTP3, we literally swapped out the delivery protocols under the entire web. And to some extent, or to most extent, no one even noticed, and that's a good thing. I mean, some things got faster. Then we have things like WASM, right? Now we have this low-level bytecode format delivering amazing things, as you guys heard this morning. So this is all amazing, this is all great, but then you get moments like this, right? I open my DevTools and I do the audit and I'm like, dude, what is going on? We have WebP, we have the case, I told you what to do to optimize images, and in fact, if you read Steve's book, it told you to optimize images 10 years ago. And I had a good laugh because I put this text with marketing before I came to the event, but we had some shout outs to the marketing team at the event a few times now already. So what is going on? Because clearly we've made huge progress in some areas, but we have not been able to move things at scale in some other areas. So why is that, right? Why is it that we're rejecting some of these performance best practices? And just to put a finer point on this, here's a headline from earlier this week. So Google launches a new Stadia service that you can try it now, and it delivers 4K resolution, 60 frames per second, gaming in your browser, low latency gaming in your browser, right? This is effectively taking your console and running it in the cloud. And it is running in your browser. So we're able to deliver this high resolution imagery 60 hertz at 60 hertz. At the same time, why is it that we can't ship a single damn frame in under 1 second on most of the web, right? And while we're at it, let's optimize those, let's actually apply gzip to all the resources, because that's still a huge unsolved problem. And yes, let's optimize images as well, right? There's some discrepancy in these two things that we need to figure out. So let's dive into the images in particular. This is an area that I've been thinking about, and I want to welcome you guys on this journey with me. So what are the potential problems and pitfalls that prevent us from fixing this problem? It could be that there's just lack of knowledge, or maybe lack of tools, or lack of automation. And I think the answer is we have all these things, right? We have books written on image optimizations. We have tons of articles. We have talks. Even at this event last year, we had an amazing talk on image optimization. So it's not like the knowledge is not there. If you want to seek it, you will find it, and find lots of it. We even have lots of tools. People have invested years and decades of time into building better libraries and things that will make your life easy to solve this problem, if you want to. We have dedicated CDNs that will gladly take that problem off your hands. And yet, for some reason, we're still, for the most part, have not solved this problem. So there's something else missing. And here's an example of this problem. So Web Almanac is a new community-driven resource that's been put together and announced last week. And there's a media chapter in it that looks at if we crawl the web, so this is using HTTP archive data, and run the Lighthouse audits on it. One of the things that Lighthouse does is that actually takes the image, tries to optimize it, and sees how much could you save if you actually optimized it. And basically what this graph shows you is that at P75, so that 75th percentile, if sites actually optimized images, it would save estimated 1.5 seconds for that site in terms of load time. And at P90, it would be over 5 seconds. So clearly, there's some room for improvement here. And we're not really making a dent in this problem. So then the question is really, it's not about the tools. It's not like we don't know how to optimize images. It's the lack of incentives, right? Why is it that sites are not adopting this best practice by default? Is it lack of awareness? Maybe. Maybe it's lack of case studies, right? Perhaps. Is it user empathy? Because we're just ignoring the user and we actually don't care, right? Is it the privilege of developing on a desktop computer and having a fast network that we lack that pain of having to wait so long? Or maybe it's just too hard. There's so many reasons for this particular problem. But I think the key observation here is it's a question about behavior. It's not a question of technology, right? So we are asking a question, whose behavior do we need to change and in what way? And I think it's really important for us to consider who are we trying to change and actually break this problem apart for different segments of the web. And this is a big leap, right? So these two questions, I think, are often used interchangeably. In fact, we often have conversations where we mentally swap these two formulations of the problem, but they're actually completely different problems. Because if you focus on one, how do we improve image optimization on the web? We can geek out for hours. We can have an entire conference on image optimization. What is the best encoder? What is the best level of settings for each encoder? What is the best format? Is it progressive or should it be something else? Should you do some other optimization? And that's all great. There's definitely room for improvement in the existing tools. But the problem is actually not in improving the existing optimizations. It's actually getting the optimizations deployed at all. And that's the second question, which is that question of behavior. Why is it that we can't get people to pay attention to this stuff to begin with? And then the second form, or third actually formulation here that I want us to consider is use optimization across the entire web, right? So not just in your particular context, but what can we as a community do to drive adoption of these best practices across the entire web? That, of course, begs the question is what is the entire web and how do you actually break that apart? One useful way to look at this is some interesting data that was shared at BlinkOn last week. Rick Byers works on Chrome, and he shared this really interesting analysis, which effectively breaks down to, if we look at the origins that our users visit in Chrome, about 30% of the page loads are coming from the top 100 sites. So that's the head, right? There's a few sites, a small number of sites that drive a lot of traffic, which intuitively makes sense. About another third comes from the next 10K sites. So that's the torso of the web. But the remaining 30% comes from a very long tail, millions of sites. Don't over-index on the actual number of millions, whether it's 3 million, 5 million, or 10 million. The point here is that we have this wide distribution. And each one of these segments, intuitively, I think, it makes sense that they have different business models, they have different engagements. You can bet that if you're in the top 100, you probably have a dedicated engineering team, maybe even a performance team, hopefully a performance team or somebody thinking about performance. The economics of the torso are very different, and the tail is actually dramatically different. And driving adoption of best practices at scale requires that we actually have a distinct strategy for both, or for all three segments. So really it boils down to this, right? Like if we try to decompose this problem, how do we drive adoption of image optimization in the top 100 sites, which is a different question from the top 10K sites, and finally the 3 million sites. And I want to focus on the tail, because I think it neatly demonstrates how different we need to think about the web and how we optimize beyond images as well. So this room is not the tail. You don't just randomly walk by an event and decide to walk in and learn about image optimization because you happen to have a website. You guys self-opted into this community, which tells me that you're likely in the top or the torso of the web. You care about the web. Most creators, most people creating sites and pages on the web are not performance experts. They will never be. They shouldn't be. They just have a simple job to get done, right? They want to get a small site online that describes their business, or when maybe they want to document something. And none of the discussions that we have here will ever reach them. So we need to think differently about how to enable that particular audience. Of course, one observation here is, well, much of the tail actually relies on some common infrastructure, right? Like, those same users don't just buy a dedicated server and set up PHP and then install their own WordPress. Some do, sure. You're probably a developer. Most turn to turnkey solutions. They'll go to a GoDaddy or some other hosting provider that makes it simple to get a site up and running online. So one point of leverage we have in the tail is these hosting providers, right? So let's write a nice letter and sign it and send it to the hosting provider saying, like, look, it's really good for the web if you were to optimize images. Like that would be just grand if you could just enable image optimization. And in some shape, way, or form, I've had this discussion at least a dozen times with different hosting providers in slightly different contexts. But even this particular discussion, turns out it doesn't actually work that way. It resonates with some of the performance people at that hosting provider, but you have to remember how, you have to think and acknowledge how the business actually operates, right? And the business of the long tail is actually very, like, it's a thin margin business. It effectively boils down to how many users can I put on a single server because I want to lower my OpEx, right? It's the fewest numbers of CPU cycles with fewest number of spindles and the least memory footprint that I can allocate to that user. So whenever I come in and ask them, hey, could you please spend a lot of CPU cycles to create more variants of the image because it'd be responsive, that's like awesome. And yes, it's gonna take a bunch of RAM to optimize the images. What they're translating to in their head is, okay, this is gonna be a disaster on my bottom line. So I feel good about making the web faster, but it doesn't actually align with my business. And for that reason, that message actually just doesn't stick. So then we come to the next thing, right? Which is like the next obvious rebuttal to this. Like, we have free CDNs, we have free services. Why doesn't the web just adopt it? Well, that's a different problem. That's an awareness problem, right? Most people that are trying to get on the web, just get a website online, are not technical. They don't understand what a CDN is, nor should they, to be honest. And they just want to get an image up on their damn webpage. And most of them struggle to get an image on the webpage. That's a whole different problem, but they're not thinking about CDNs. So we're constantly losing at this game because new people are creating content on the web and they're just opting into this bad behavior, which is not using CDNs, not using any image optimization services, and their hosting providers, frankly, are not set up to handle that cost. So here's an interesting question to ponder. How many of you are image optimization experts for Facebook or Instagram? Right? How many do you know? There are many content creators that go to these services and publish regularly, but there's no web performance industry around Instagram and Facebook. Like, this problem is not a problem on those platforms. Why is that? Well, their economics are different. They have a giant advertising flywheel which is able to underwrite image optimization, optimized delivery, and deployment of new formats. They take that entire problem and solve it because they have a different way to fund the entire user experience. And they compete on user experience. They know that by delivering better image optimization, they have faster load times, better retention, better engagement, and which translates into more visits and then just continues to turn that flywheel of advertising in their favor. That's not how the tail of the web works. So we need a different solution, right? The open web tail lives and dies by the OpEx margin. So we can't compete with that. We can't change those economics. The torso, interestingly enough, thrives on integration and upsells. So you can turn to hosting providers which will gladly offer you additional services for additional fees, and they will deliver on the optimized experience, whether you're trying to host a WordPress site or your own site or your own stack or something else. So these things exist, and that's great. But money matters, right? And I think we often ignore that problem. We think of it as a technical problem and lack of tools, but the finance and the business part of the ecosystem is a huge factor. So my claim is that if we actually want to solve this problem, right, if we want to get to 2029 and stand on stage and say, like, what have we accomplished in the last decade? I'd love to be in a place where we could say, like, you remember back in the day, like when we had to hand roll WebP optimizers and that, like that? Yeah, those were the days, right? Like nowadays, we don't have image optimization problems. What would it take to get there? My claim is it needs to be free. The number of choices for the user should be 0. You should never have to educate anyone on why image optimization matters. Most people that put images online, whether that's your marketing department or someone just setting up a site, should never have to make that choice. So as platform builders for your own brands, I think that's something that you should focus on, which is prevent people from making the bad choice in the first place. If you're trying to police them after the fact, you will never win that game. And finally, the tools must do the work for you, right? So this gets me to the last point, which is I think we actually need to have a different strategy. It's knowledge, tools, automation, and incentives are prerequisites. Those are all necessary components. But we need to have a conversation about different strategies for deploying each one of these things in a torso and a head and a tail. It's a different playbook, if you will. And that means understanding the actual stakeholders. Who are the users that live in that particular segment of the market? What are their needs? What are the business models of the stakeholders that support them, whether it's a hosting provider or somebody else? And what are the differences in the tools? Maybe the folks in a head are willing to spend more time tweaking the knobs and shifting quality settings, but the folks in the tail don't know, don't care, and never will touch that functionality. So the question is, how do we actually activate the tail, right? Like if we stick with the image example, what would it take for us to change the dynamics of this industry? And one of my hypotheses currently is that we actually need to put the agent back into the user agent. And what I mean by agent is put the smarts, like make the user agent smart, helpful, and something that has your back, right? Something that helps you along the way. This is an interesting insight for me in particular because I think many people here will be familiar with this. So the Extensible Web Manifesto came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even longer. And the observation here was, as browser vendors, as browser engineers, generally when we try to tackle a very high-level feature, we fail because the behaviors are really complicated. We can't provide all the configuration options. So really what we should do is offer low-level primitives to the web platform that allow you, the developers and folks building websites, to compose your own variants and prototype rapidly. And then maybe once we find the definite cow paths, we just kind of pave them in that direction. So the gist of the Extensible Web Manifesto is we should focus on low-level primitives. We should try to explain existing features. So if you see some high-level thing, like for example, the video tag. A video tag is a baked-in web component, right? So web components are basically trying to explain some of these like form elements and other things that are just shipped by default in the browser. And I think that's generally good. I mean, there's a lot of really good insights into that. And in fact, we should prioritize all this work above all else. We should not try to prioritize building high-level features. We should try to explain it. And I drank that Kool-Aid, and I believed it, and I still believe it. But I think there is some consequences that we missed out along the way. Implicit in this is that we're actually leaning on developers to drive adoption. Right? There's nothing that the browser can really do to force adoption. It really is about activating each site on its own, which means that the existing web cannot just get those features for free. And oftentimes we lean on users to make the informed choice. So as someone that's composing a new website, I need to make an informed choice on which framework I should use, what are the attributes that I like about it, and then somehow navigate through that forest of 1,000 choices to end up with the right outcome. Right? Does it have the right image optimization built in? Does it have the right bundling? Does it enforce all of these other things? It's a very tough matrix to get yourself through. So no wonder people are struggling. And a very concrete example of this that I was reflecting on currently is back in 2015, there was a proposal for on WICG for, hey, let's add a standard way to lazy load images. And in fact, why don't we put that into the browser by default? Like, why shouldn't the browser just by default lazy load all images? On the surface, that makes a lot of sense, right? That would actually help not only, that would help the entire web, I think is the actual observation, right? The web as it is today. And I wrote a long essay on why I think that's a terrible idea. I clipped the kind of the relevant parts, but effectively it boils down to this is a very complicated problem. Lazy loading is very complicated. Like you have different behaviors across different websites, how much you preload, what conditions trigger preload. Like this is just a like very, very gnarly thing that we as a browser probably will get wrong and upset people. So instead, we should focus on low-level primitives, like we should have intersection observer API that tells you how far the element is away from the viewport or if it's in the viewport. We should have resource hints and preload so you can preload stuff. If you want to trigger on whether the user is trying to save data, we should add a hint for that. And we should have net info, and there's like lots and lots of these components. Good news is, we actually shipped all of these things. Like they exist. So you can, in fact, build very powerful lazy loading capabilities today on the web. The bad part is, how many websites do you go to actually use lazy loading effectively? Very few, right? So something went not right there. Like, this is necessary, but this is not sufficient, I think. So this is probably a very clear statement of denial. So I was, to defend myself, I don't think I was wrong in that we needed to have low-level primitives. I think that is actually correct. What I was wrong about is saying we shouldn't do the high-level thing. Because what I focused on was the segment of the market where developers were actually smart enough, motivated enough, and aware enough to build a solution that makes sense for their particular use case. And the general observation here is I think we've actually kind of over-indexed on low-level primitives. I think we need to put the agent back into user agent to provide services by default that help most web users to move this thing forward. And we should do that with equal urgency. So in that particular example on previous slide, we should have ran both things in parallel. There's no reason why we should have stopped the default behavior from advancing at the same pace as all of the low-level primitives. So here's my formulation, I think, of what we need to do to fix the images problem as we move forward. The only way we're going to fix it, especially if you want to fix it in the tail, is we have to fix the problem before it happens. We have to optimize the image before it leaves the device and get it to the storage system in somewhat optimized form. Not optimal form, but somewhat optimized form, right? What I'm talking about is the, hey, you just uploaded a 20 megapixel image into a thing that needs a 400 by 400 pixel preview. Very common on the web. And that's what we need to fix. Now, when I shopped this idea around, I got horror in the eyes of many engineers, and I think it's because I actually went to folks that work on images. So their first reaction is like, oh my God, this is such a complicated space. You're going to tell me that you're going to do magic? What does that mean? Because like I have 15 settings that I need to tweak for my particular configuration to get the optimal performance out of my images. And I don't believe in this magic that you're going to do. And I think they have a point, and we need to provide a path for both. And here's a very good example. If you're an iOS user, you may have seen this if you tried the developer previews. So iOS recently shipped a new intent on their platform where if you go and do the file upload and you pick an image, they actually bring up a selector box that says, what image size do you want to upload this in? This is not a site implementation. This is just a native UI implementation. And they offer you 4 options, actual size, small, medium, and large. I think this is actually amazing. My first impression actually was like, whoa, what does small and medium mean? It doesn't actually tell you what it's about to do. But of course, that's a question I ask as an engineer who thinks about image optimization. But on the other hand, I think this may actually be the most impactful thing that we may have done, and I'm going to take credit for the work that iOS did here. This may be the most impactful thing that we as an industry have done moving forward so far to fix the problem of unoptimized images. Now, I think this is a huge step forward, but it's not sufficient either. I think we can actually do better. So myself and a few others have been thinking about how we want to approach this problem, and we have a proposal out. No code has been written, but the observation is we actually have an input type file, And we actually allow you to specify what image types you're willing to accept, right? So if you can say, I only accept JPEG images. Let's build on that. That's an actual low-level primitive that exists today, and we could probably extend. And what would that look like? We could provide a native UI, kind of intent UI, similar to iOS, that allows the user to select some sort of options. But we need to give sites control, because what does small mean? I'm not sure, right? It would be nice if the site was able to express some sort of preferences. So if I'm building a photo storage service, I could have one set of settings that is different from, I'm just looking for a 400 by 400 pixel profile mugshot for my social network. So hypothetically, what could that look like? Well, we know that one of the use cases is translating into different output formats, right? There's, in theory, nothing that stops the browser from accepting a certain file type and then outputting another file type. That is actually a very common operation that is done the moment you upload an image on the server, right? Because you want to standardize what format you store images in. That can actually be done by the browser, right? So you can specify perhaps even a preference order. So if some browser does not support WebP, you can put it into JPEG. Hypothetically, maybe interesting. Another one could be, well, we know that there are requirements around file sizes, right? We've all had that experience of coming to a website and it says, please upload an image here, but make sure it's no more than 800 kilobytes and 400 by 400 pixels. At which point you start to tear out the hair in your head because like, what do I do? Like, install GIMP? Like, actually, the next thing that you do is you start Googling for like web service to resize image, and you end up on some shady website, right? Like that's actually what happens. This is a terrible user experience. So let's try and fix that. Why can't we actually say that, like, ideally, actually, I want an image that is at most 800 kilobytes. Maybe we allow some very high-level settings for the quality that you're looking for, so in that trade-off optimization of when the browser is making, like, should I spend more CPU cycles versus less CPU cycles? We can allow you some very high-level behaviors, but by default, we would default to auto and just say, let the user agent figure out the best approach, right? What about output dimensions, right? We could ask, or we could allow you to specify what is the actual output that you're requesting. If it's 400 by 400 pixels, is that what you need? Great, let's give you that. Of course, there's some really tricky cases here, which is, what if you have a different aspect ratio, right? So you're looking at 1:1 aspect ratio. Well, you know, the horror, like, what if the browser actually provided some native modal UI that allows you to crop things? It's not crazy, right? Like, other platforms have done it. This is normal. Users have, they know how to use these tools, right? And we have this magical machine learning thing that I keep hearing about, right? So maybe the user agent could actually just even position the box on the most salient element and just allow the user to say okay and proceed. Or maybe you can just automate it entirely. I'm not sure what the right design space for this thing, but I think that's the direction that we need to be thinking about. And it turns out that while we're focusing, well, I've been approaching this problem from the viewpoint of the tail, the torso and the head of the web actually wants this problem too, or wants this problem to be solved too. So for example, there's a recent case study from Twitter where they implemented a native downsampling, or they polyfilled a native downsampling in the browser for image uploads when you use their web client, and it had double-digit improvement in the rate of successive uploads on their service. Meaning, if you don't upload massive images, more images make it to your servers. That's kind of nice, right? Users are happier because their images are actually making it there. And if they're experiencing that problem and they had to go out of their way and build this entire pipeline, chances are most other people are not doing it. So this will help everyone, but tail in particular. What about video? That's a really interesting question to think about, because on one hand, it's actually very similar to images. It's even harder. The economics of transcoding video are even more complicated and much more costly. But good news, there's some actual proposals being worked on. Some folks at Microsoft have been working with a couple of services, and there's an API being designed for very simple manipulation of video. So things like slicing, concatenating, and doing other things, right? So if you imagine building a client where you need 10 seconds of video because you're trying to build like a story interface similar to, let's say, Instagram or Snapchat. Today, there's no way to easily clip 10 seconds of video. You have to upload like the 2-minute version of 4K resolution video to the server, which then has to cut those 10 seconds. That's crazy. So here you should be like, we should have an API to actually load the video and allow you to slice it. I think a really interesting space to explore is how could that look like in a declarative form? So, and not just a JavaScript API, but also extending file input to say, you know what I really want is to upload a video, but it needs to be at most 10 seconds. So if you ever used Instagram and tried to create the story, they have a really nice UI flow where you pick a video and it immediately drops you into an editor, which already clips the 10-second timeline, and you can just move the timeline. Why can't the web offer that, right? That's a very simple operation. Coming back to native image lazy loading, this is something that I've rallied against before, and in retrospect, I think I was wrong. So I think it should be a thing. I'd like to try to make it a thing. Hopefully, some of you agree as well. It is a thing, actually, in Chrome for Chrome Data Saver users. So if you enable Save Data option in your settings, Chrome will implement this for you, and it try to lazy load images. But what about just making it on by default? There's definitely some tricky edge cases there because it will affect some of the telemetry, some of the implementations. So this wouldn't be an easy thing to pull off, but I think we should try. So with that, I want to put this question out to this group, and I'd love to engage with you guys throughout the rest of this conference. What does it mean for us to put the agent back into the user agent? We talked about images, but what are the other problems that we're not thinking about that perhaps you're fighting with that the user agent could solve better? Both as a low-level primitive, but also as a high-level primitive that it can be applied across the industry. So with that, thank you.
That's, I really like the head, tail, torso breakdown. It's really interesting because I think it's very tempting for us, and I think, maybe not, scratch that. It's not tempting. I think you're absolutely right. Like, when we are in a room like this or we're surrounded by people like ourselves, we tend to have this sort of perspective that we're all talking to other developers like us, and like, right. It tends to be, Andre mentioned a little bit, like the comment this morning he made was that he talked to somebody after a conference, was talking about how they felt like a lot of performance talks, they felt like they were being judged or like talked down to, right. And I think that's, a lot of that is that communication barrier, like that perspective of head versus tail versus torso is helpful. Yep. So for this conversation, then one of the things that struck me, I guess, is like, we need to kind of be okay with like good enough solutions to some extent for some of this, right? Yep. Have you started talking to developers already about this? Are you finding that like we are having a hard time accepting some of the proposals because of that?
Yeah, so as I said, I found it interesting that some of the early reactions for the proposal, so like you post a proposal in a developer setting, and the first people that see it are developers that have been thinking about this problem, because it's like, oh wow, there's a new image-related thing. I've been thinking about images for 10 years. Let me look at it. What? You're going to auto-optimize everything? Like, crazy talk. Yeah, that was the first feedback, right? And it's been interesting to react to it and just kind of absorb it and understand, like, so why is it that we have that kind of knee-jerk reaction to it? And it took me, I guess, a decade almost to come to this conclusion, because like I went through all these stages, right? It's like, sure. Okay, to optimize images, like it's lack of knowledge. I'm gonna go write a like 10-page web fundamentals guide on image optimization, which by the way, many people at Google make fun of me about. It's like, really, you're gonna talk about like byte compression? Anyway, so wrote that, did lots of talks, right? And I can repeat these talks at every conference, and you know, there are good case studies, like it helps. But it's kind of like you try to stop the bleeding, but you never solve the actual root problem, right? Sure. So you can't win at that game. So then you move upstream and you're like, okay, really it's about tools. Like what we need is better automation. Let's go figure out how to like get servers to adopt this and CDNs to adopt it. You have some success there, but then you cross that Rubicon and you're like, so why haven't we still solved the problem? You keep looking at the HTTP archive data and the damn needle doesn't move, right? And you're like, And then you start getting into, okay, well, let me talk to hosting providers. and then you started to appreciate the differences in business models,
Sure.
right? So like it took me a long time to go through this journey and appreciate it, and I think I'm just maybe I'm not the only one that actually understands this problem, but I think it's socializing that and understanding it and appreciating. It's like looking at it from the lens of like, okay, this feature is being designed for this group of people. It'll likely be adopted by this group of people. And maybe that is the shelf life of it.
Sure.
Right? Like, but what about, how do you solve that same problem in this segment of the market that will never learn about performance, right?
So the other thing that struck me, particularly on like when you give the iOS example of like the image upload stuff, iOS has the benefit of, in that particular scenario, owning the entire system, the platform. They don't have to care about, is Android going to implement some sort of an image process thing to make sure that we're matching up, our signals and stuff like that. That doesn't work on the web, right? Like the web we expect now some sort of consistency, at least with any sort of standardized thing. We expect some consistency in behavior, across browsers. Now, there's always a little bit of difference maybe in some of the UI elements to some extent.
Sure.
But I'm wondering about is something like this image thing, right? Like there's a high level of user testing that has to happen for us to make sure that what is projected by the browser is something that the tail is going to be comfortable with and use. Do you have any plans, like how is that going to look, balancing being able to test like what the actual outcome looks like versus the fact that Safari and Firefox and Chrome might all disagree and they're all going to implement at different times? And
so that's a good question. So first of all, the iOS example that we showed is a native intent, right? So it's the same intent that you would get outside of the web browser as well. So they have that benefit of just like they enforce that effectively across the entire platform, which I think is actually like a neat solution across the board, right? Because they're actually acknowledging that this is not just a problem on the web; it's also a problem in apps, right? In many apps. The good news is that is a problem that browsers like Chrome are solving, right? We run on all platforms, so we can't rely on native infrastructure. Like Safari relies on their network stack. Chrome ships their own network stack because we need to work across all these different things. So there are browsers that are able to deploy that across all platforms. To your point of differences in the UIs, that's a really good question. Good news is that we have smart UX teams that know how to optimize these things, right? And do the appropriate user testing and derive the right solutions. I think it's actually a good opportunity for different browsers to try and experiment with different things, like what makes most sense. One could imagine that there's a browser that, crazy talk, provides some set of filters and like more than just basic photo manipulation or like resizing, right?
Sure.
That I actually would love to see that. Like, what would a browser for content creators look like, right? An integrated media library with some basic editing capabilities. Like, we need to empower more people to publish on the web. So I think that's an amazing space for us to explore and innovate. And alongside that, we'll get more primitives baked in that allow us to do the optimization in place.
I think that's I'm all for the empowering folks, more people to get on the web and to be able to be content creators, because I think that's one of the big challenges we have right now. Like, if anybody's paid attention to like the indie web kind of conversation, everybody, I think, fundamentally is like, that's great. We love the fact that you own your own content. Everybody's empowered to do it.
Right.
And that may be the right way to do it for, from certain perspectives. However, the complexity that's involved is something that we absolutely need to solve if we want to actually make that work at scale. One of the questions that somebody posed from the audience was when you were talking about particularly incentives and stuff like that, right? It was inevitable, it was probably going to pop up. But the Google signaling slow sites, right? The article that came out recently where they were talking about like if a slow loading site is presenting some way to show the user that this is a slow site. Just trying to get your perspective on that. You can pretend that you don't work for Google. We are recording, but we just won't let any Googlers watch it. I don't ban some IP addresses. But also, like, in which part of the segment do you think that helps, if it does help? Is this a torso thing? Is it a torso? Did I say that right? Torso? Okay, I felt like I misspoke for a second. Yeah.
That's a good question. I need to think about the segment. So first of all, if you haven't seen the article, this is something, so last week we had the Chrome Developer Summit, and in there we demoed some very, very, very early UX explorations around what would it mean for a browser to provide some incentives around speed. And a good example here is HTTPS, right? We've been on this march over the last 5 years to migrate from, by default, having the gray bar to be HTTP to, but where we want to get to is the gray bar being HTTPS, right? It should be assumed by default that you are secure. And along the way, we had this like trajectory of, well, you know, at certain, like in 2017, we're gonna start marking pages that have a form as red in the bar because it's not secure. So that's a really compelling example where it actually worked. Like, people clearly paid attention to those incentives. Those were not the only incentives, but I think browsers, Firefox did the same, Chrome did the same. I think those incentives had a huge impact on moving the industry forward. And by the way, the industry was kicking and screaming along the way. Right? It's like they did not want to change. But I think at the end of the day, we made the right call, we made the right trade-offs, and we're in a better place now. So what we're doing here is applying that frame and saying, could we do the same thing to web performance? Like, what would it mean for a browser to highlight good performing sites? And we're very, very early on that exploration. So please don't over-index on those particular mocks that we have there. But the basic idea is somewhere in the UI, if you're visiting a site that is fast, we want to, in a way, reward it. Like, highlight this is a good experience. Or maybe if it's taking a very long time, we can give people some context. I'm like, yeah, the site usually takes slow. Ha.
Yeah, little subtle shade there.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing that stands out as a little bit of a difference between the security signals and the performance signals there is that with the performance signals, as a user, I'm probably aware that it's loading slow right now. Like, in the moment, I probably get it.
Yep.
So it almost, whereas like in security, one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about the security movement, that whole TLS everywhere thing, was that we had to attack the sites and the developers alongside informing the users and educating them and building up that knowledge sort of through the information there. Do we need to worry about like educating the users about the performance of this stuff, or is that not less of an issue? Is this more purely like on incentivizing the actual site owners?
I think that's an experiment that I'd love to see run, right? Like, we do know that users learn behaviors kind of ambiently. So if you interact with a fast site, you interact with it more. Or actually, put differently, we run experiments where we intentionally slowed down the site and then removed that. And we observed that the users that were exposed to that control group actually interacted less, because over time they've learned that they expect that the site is going to be slow, so they just do, like, for example, fewer Google searches. All right, so what would it mean for us to expose more visual cues about speed? Would it change their behavior? I don't know, but I think that's a really interesting area to explore.
Sure,
like,
yeah.
if you have an actual green indicator when you browse a site that tells you that, yeah, the site is like, it's secure, it's fast, it's good, would you use it more? I don't know.
You could see, there's part of me that, like, the performance nut in me is like, you know, greedily rubbing my hands together at the idea of the fact that this could make those sort of, you know, studies even more impactful, like the correlation even stronger in a scenario like that when it's overtly signaled like that.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you, Ilya. That was great.
Thank you.